in the early 1960s and peaks in around 66, 68, and that's of course the impetus afforded by accelerated government spending in the Vietnam War. And as that effect begins to wear off, you get the return back to trend in effect. A graph like this should be adjusted for fluctuations in capacity utilization, but I cannot explain how that should be done here, so you just have to use your imagination and see that there is a trend. And that trend continues essentially through the crisis of the 60s, the period when the newspapers were worried that we were about to enter Great Depression. But then after that, the profit rate is mildly rising. Now, if you could use your imagination, you can project where the profit rate might have gone had not a very important thing taken place. And that important thing was a tremendous lowering of real wages relative to productivity. And in future parts, I'm going to adjust this graph so you can see that. But the second variable, I'm going to come back to the profit rate. The second variable, which is crucial, is the interest rate. As I said, accumulation is driven by the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. The interest rate here is kind of the cost of capital, as business puts it. It's opportunity cost. And you can see that it rises from a very low rate in the 1947 and peaks at 14%. It's below 1% in 1947, peaks at 14% in the late 1980s. Only a part can be attributed to any action by Volcker, which is another issue I'd be happy to talk about. Well, I have to say that I have to leave before the question and answer session because the timing of this panel has changed and I cannot stay. So my apologies, I will not be here to talk about these issues. But so you'll have to take my word for it. But it's possible to argue that the Volcker shock was a minor part. I've got this shaded in when Volcker comes in. And it's really not possible to attribute the whole rise in the interest rate to poor Volcker. And he continues on when it comes down. So I think that that demonization. So in defense of Paul Volcker, I should say, he's not to blame for the interest rate patterns in general, though there was a shock part there, clear. What is interesting is after that, the interest rate drops substantially. And this drop is in fact the same if I can find it, it's the same in the rest of the world also, because the second graph is the interest rate in the US, the dark line, and the interest rate of US trading partners. And you can see that there's a tremendous parallelism in these movements. And Paul Volcker, as far as I know, was not running the rest of the world at that time, so one cannot attribute everything to him. So, if you then take the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate, you get this picture, which is a steady decline in the profit rate of enterprise, to use Marx's term, until the 1980s. At the bottom, it even goes negative. And then this dramatic rise. And the dramatic rise is composed of two factors: a reduction in the growth of real wages relative to productivity, in Marxian terms, a tremendous, extraordinary historical rise in the rate of surplus value, and a decline in the interest rate, which is a policy variant. Both a policy, because you can see historically that they came from struggles which, as someone pointed out in the last panel, that the capitalist class won decisively. I'm going to skip over the profit part here and get to the key variable. The dark line here is hourly real compensation, and the dotted line is hourly productivity. These are index numbers, so their levels don't have any meaning. They intersect in, I don't know, 1980 or something like that, but the key point is that their relative movements matter a lot. And several people mentioned the labor accord that kept in place until about the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher come on the world stage, and that labor accord then falls apart. And here you can see what happens. The productivity continues to rise because intensification of labor and mechanization continue in force, especially as unions are broken. And at the same point, at the same time, real wages begin to stagnate and rise much more slowly. The gap between the two is the old-fashioned rise in a rate of exploitation. But this is quite unparalleled in recent historical terms, and it really required a breaking of the institutions that supported labor. And for that reason, I would argue that neoliberalism, which was an export of this, wasn't really about attacking the state. It was realigning the state, concentrating the state on the interests of capital on a global scale and exporting that concentration. So the state actually became more powerful in some ways. It just simply was focused on one side. Capitalists understand they need the state, that's for sure. So this drop in the interest rate, which I mentioned before, had a tremendous impact because it allowed the globalization of financial capital. It made it extremely cheap for capital to move. It created a boom in accumulation because it made the profit rate of enterprise rise sharply. So boom in real industrial accumulation, but also created bubbles in the stock market and financial sectors and all that, which I don't have time to spend much time on. But those have been talked about, that we got a period of this extensive bubble. I'm going to skip over the inequality data, which people have talked about, and this is a picture of the debt-to-income ratios. How did workers survive in this time with wages stagnant? Of course, they were encouraged to go further and further into debt. So consumption was kept up, and the cheap interest rates are very important from that point of view also. It created a boom in consumer spending and in business spending because it made it cheaper to borrow. So all of this sounds great. So if you could do this, why can't you just keep on doing it? Well, the answer is you can't lower the interest rate forever. This has been noted before in history many times, that when it reaches around zero, then you have a limit. It is not just a liquidity trap, it's really the objective limit to this policy of creating what is in effect, I don't want to call it an artificial boom, but let's call it a cultivated boom, because it consisted of two things: a tax on labor-supporting institutions so that the workers' position and strength was reduced or real wages were abated, and of course globalization, which brought the World Reserve Army into contact with labor in the US and in the developed world, which of course, as Marx puts it, checked the pretensions of labor, because that Reserve Army was there to prevent wage increases. Every time you talk about wage increases or things, they say, okay, we're going to move to Vietnam or China or to Indonesia or whatever. And they do, in fact, do that. So we have all of those elements: the household spending, the real estate bubble, the financial bubble, and the real growth of accumulation because of the difference between the two. Now, many people made the point that this is unsustainable. So if it's unsustainable, then what are its limits? I want to first talk about the global, so the limits arise when you cannot squeeze labor anymore, and I'm not sure that that limit is over, by the way. I would like to believe it's over, but I wouldn't argue that necessarily. But you can't lower the interest rate anymore, and that's clear. So the bubble and boom came to a halt. The global effects are quite uneven. You have extreme financial problems now in countries like Iceland, Greece, and Spain, which were supposedly protected by the EU, but are not, because in fact they are very uneven development within the EU. You have merely bad conditions in countries like the UK and US. There's recent talk now about speculation against the British pound. If you saw the New York Times yesterday, there's a whole discussion of people having met, Soros's people included, about seeing whether they can do to the British pound what they already did to it before, and they're looking forward to making billions. Then there are countries like Norway and Canada, which have been more circumspect and have avoided some of the financial crisis, but they still are subject to the unemployment that comes from the contraction of world exports, of course, because they depend on that. And then you have the developing world, which is in a kind of shock because it came out of a very bad decade in the 1980s. The previous crisis was very extended and had a terrible impact on development. In Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, in Peru. In Chile, we know how that was solved. And cheap finance was a way out to expand employment and also to expand all kinds of other activities that cheap finance can expand, like bubbles, real estate, export-led growth, because the bubble in the center was